The Mohawk people are the most easterly tribe of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy. The name means people of the Flint Place. Quote, they are an Iroquoian-speaking indigenous people of North America. The Mohawk were historically based in the Mohawk Valley in present-day upstate New York west of the Hudson River. Their territory ranged north to the St. Lawrence River, southern Quebec and eastern Ontario, south to greater New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, eastward to the Green Mountains of Vermont and westward to the border with the Iroquoian Oneida Nation's traditional homeland territory. As one of the 5 original members of the Iroquois League, the Mohawk were known as the Keepers of the Eastern Door. For hundreds of years, they guarded the Iroquois Confederation against invasion from the direction by tribes from the New England and Lower New York areas. The current major settlements include areas around Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River in Canada and New York. Etymology. In the Mohawk language, the people say that they are from Kanyankata, or Flintstone Place. The Mohawk became wealthy traders as other nations in their confederacy needed the flint for tool-making. Their Algonquin-speaking neighbors, the people of Mohawk, a name transliterated by the Dutch as Mohican or Mahican, referred to the people of Kanyankata as Mohawklin. The Dutch heard and wrote this term as Mohawk, and also referred to the Mohawk as Eagle or Makwa. The French colonists adapted these latter terms as Ainier and Maki, respectively. They also referred to the people by the generic Iroquois, a French derivation of the Algonquin term for the 5 nations, meaning snake people. The Algonquins and Iroquois were traditional competitors and enemies. History since colonization. First contact with European settlers. In the upper Hudson and Mohawk Valley regions, the Mohawk had long had contact with the Algonquin-speaking Mohican people, who occupied territory along the Hudson River, as well as other Algonquin and Iroquoian tribes to the north around the Great Lakes. The Mohawk had extended their own influence into the St. Lawrence River Valley, which they maintained for hunting grounds. They are believed to have defeated the St. Lawrence Iroquoians in the 16th century, and kept control of the territory. In addition to hunting and fishing, for centuries the Mohawk cultivated productive maize fields on the fertile floodplains along the Mohawk River, west of the Pine Bush. In the 17th century the Mohawk encountered both the Dutch, who went up the Hudson River and established a trading post in 1614 at the confluence of the Mohawk and Hudson Rivers, and the French, who came south into the territory from New France. The Dutch were primarily merchants and the French also conducted fur trading. The Jesuit missionaries were active among First Nations and Native Americans, seeking converts to Catholicism. In 1614, the Dutch opened a trading post at Fort Nassau, New Netherland. The Dutch initially traded for furs with the local Mohican, who occupied the territory along the Hudson River. Following a raid in 1626 when the Mohawk resettled along the south side of the Mohawk River, in 1628 they mounted an attack against the Mohican, pushing them back to the area of present-day Connecticut. The people of Kanyankata gained a near monopoly in the fur trade with the Dutch by prohibiting the nearby Algonquin-speaking tribes to the north or east to trade with them, but did not entirely control this. European contact resulted in a devastating smallpox epidemic among the Mohawk in 1635. This reduced the population by 63%, from 7,740 to 2,830, as they had no immunity to the new disease. By 1642 they had regrouped from 4 into 3 villages, recorded by Catholic missionary priest Isaac Jogues in 1642 as Osenanon, and Agaran, and Tionontogwen, all along the south side of the Mohawk River from east to west. These were recorded by speakers of other languages with different spellings, and historians have struggled to reconcile various accounts, as well as to align them with archaeological studies of the areas. For instance, Johannes Megapolensis, a Dutch minister, recorded the spelling of the same three villages as Asura, Banagiro, and Thenondiogo. Late 20th century archaeological studies have determined that Osenanon was located about 9 miles west of the current city of Orisville. The two were mistakenly conflated by a tradition that developed in the late 19th century in the Catholic Church, while the Dutch later established settlements in present-day Schenectady and Schoharie. Further west in the Mohawk Valley, merchants in Fort Nassau continued to control the fur trading. Schenectady was established essentially as a farming settlement, where Dutch took over some of the former Mohawk maize fields in the floodplain along the river. Through trading, the Mohawk and Dutch became allies of a kind. During their alliance, the Mohawks allowed Dutch Protestant missionary Johannes Megapolensis to come into the tribe and teach the Christian message. He operated from the Fort Nassau area about 6 years, writing a record in 1644 of his observations of the Mohawk, the language, and the culture. While he noted the ritual of torture of captives, he recognized that the society had few other killings, especially compared to the Netherlands of that period. The trading relations between the Mohawk and Dutch helped them maintain peace even during the periods of Kiaft's War and the Esopus Wars, when the Dutch fought localized battles with other tribes. In addition, Dutch trade partners equipped the Mohawk with guns to fight against other First Nations who were allied with the French, including the Ojibwe, Huron-Wendat, and Algonquin. In 1645, the Mohawk made peace for a time with the French, who were trying to keep a peace of the fur trade. During the Pequot War, the Pequot and other Algonquin Indians of coastal New England sought an alliance with the Mohawk against English colonists of that region. Disrupted by the losses to smallpox, the Mohawk refused the alliance. They killed the Pequot Sachem Sassacus who had come to them for refuge. In the winter of 1651, the Mohawk attacked to the southeast and overwhelmed the Algonquin in the coastal areas. They took between 500 to 600 captives. In 1664, the Pequot of New England killed the Mohawk ambassador, starting a war that resulted in the destruction of the Pequot. As the English and their allies in New England entered the conflict, trying to suppress the Native Americans in the region, the Mohawk also attacked other members of the Pequot Confederacy in a war that lasted until 1671. In 1666, the French attacked the Mohawk in the central New York area, burning the 3 Mohawk villages south of the river and the stored food supply. One of the conditions of the peace was that the Mohawk accept Jesuit missionaries. Beginning in 1669, missionaries attempted to convert Mohawk to Christianity, operating a mission in Osenanon 9 miles west of present-day Orisville, New York until 1684, when the Mohawk destroyed it, killing several priests. Over time, some converted Mohawk relocated to Jesuit mission villages established south of Montreal on the St. Lawrence River in the early 1700s, Carnawake and Kanesatake. These Mohawk were joined by members of other tribes but dominated the settlements by number. Many converted to Roman Catholicism. In the 1740s, Mohawk and French set up another village upriver, which is known as Aquisauce. Today a Mohawk reserve, it spans the St. Lawrence River and present-day international boundaries to New York, United States, where it is known as the St. Regis Mohawk Reservation. Kateri Tekakwitha, born at Osenanon in the late 1650s, has become noted as a Mohawk convert to Catholicism. She moved with relatives to Caughnawaga on the north side of the river after her parents' deaths. She was known for her faith and a shrine was built to her in New York. In the late 20th century, she was beatified and was canonized in October 2012 as the first Native American Catholic saint. She is also recognized by the Episcopal and Lutheran churches. After the fall of New Netherland to England in 1664, the Mohawk in New York traded with the English and sometimes acted as their allies. During King Philip's War, Metacom, sachem of the warring Wampanoag Pokanoket, decided to winter with his warriors near Albany in 1675. Encouraged by the English, the Mohawk attacked and killed all but 40 of the 400 Pokanoket. For the 1690s, Protestant missionaries sought to convert the Mohawk in the New York colony. Many were baptized with English surnames, while others were given both first and surnames in English. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Mohawk and Algonquin and Abenaki tribes in New England were involved in raids conducted by the French and English against each other's settlements during Queen Anne's War and other conflicts. They conducted a growing trade in captives, holding them for ransom. Neither of the colonial governments generally negotiated for common captives, and it was up to local European communities to raise funds to ransom the residents. In some cases, French and Abenaki raiders transported captives from New England to Montreal and the Mohawk mission villages. The Mohawk at Kanawake adopted numerous young women and children to add to their own members, having suffered losses to disease and warfare. For instance, among them were numerous survivors of the more than 100 captives taken in the Deerfield raid in western Massachusetts. The minister of Deerfield was ransomed and returned to Massachusetts, but his daughter was adopted by a Mohawk family and ultimately assimilated and married a Mohawk man. During the era of the French and Indian War, Anglo-Mohawk partnership relations were maintained by men such as Sir William Johnson in New York, Conrad Weiser, and Hendrick Dainogan. Johnson called the Albany Congress in June 1754 to discuss with the Iroquois chiefs repair of the damaged diplomatic relationship between the British and the Mohawk, along with securing the cooperation and support in fighting the French in engagements in North America. American Revolutionary War. During the second and third quarters of the 18th century, most of the Mohawk in the province of New York lived along the Mohawk River at Canajoharie. A few lived at Schoharie, and the rest lived about 30 miles downstream at the Tiononderoga Castle, also called Fort Hunter. These two major settlements were traditionally called the Upper Castle and the Lower Castle. The Lower Castle was almost contiguous with Sir Peter Warren's Bush. Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, built his first house on the north bank of the Mohawk River, almost opposite Warren's Bush, and established the settlement of Johnstown. The Mohawk were among the 4 Iroquois tribes that allied with the British during the American Revolutionary War. They had a long trading relationship with the British and hoped to gain support to prohibit colonists encroaching into the territory in the Mohawk Valley. Joseph Brant acted as a war chief and successfully led raids against British and ethnic German colonists in the Mohawk Valley, who had been given land by the British administration near the rapids at present-day Little Falls, New York. A few prominent Mohawk, such as the sachem Little Abraham at Fort Hunter, remained neutral throughout the war. Joseph Louis Cook, Algonquin, a veteran of the French and Indian War and ally of the rebels, offered his services to the Americans, receiving an officer's commission from the Continental Congress. He led Oneida warriors against the British. During this war, Johannes Tekarihoga was the civil leader of the Mohawk. He died around 1780. Catherine Croghan, a clan mother and wife of Mohawk war chief Joseph Brant, named her brother Henry Croghan as the new Tekari Hoga, in retaliation for Brant's raids in the valley. The rebel colonists organized Sullivan's expedition. It conducted extensive raids against other Iroquois settlements in central and western New York, destroying 40 villages, crops and winter stores. Many Mohawk and other Iroquois migrated to Canada for refuge near Fort Niagara, struggling to survive the winter. After the Revolution, after the American victory, the British ceded the claim to land in the colonies, and the Americans forced their allies, the Mohawk and others, to give up the territories in New York. Most of the Mohawk migrated to Canada, where the Crown gave them some land in compensation. The Mohawk at the Upper Castle fled to Fort Niagara, while most of those at the Lower Castle went to villages near Montreal. Joseph Brant led a large group of Iroquois out of New York to what became the reserve of the Six Nations of the Grand River, Ontario. Brant continued as a political leader of the Mohawk for the rest of his life. This land extended 100 miles from the head of the Grand River to the head of Lake Erie, where it discharges. Another Mohawk war chief, John D. Seronto, led a group of Mohawk to the Bay of Quinte. Other Mohawks settled in the vicinity of Montreal and upriver, joining the established communities at Kahnawake, Kanesatake, and Akwesasne. On November 11, 1794, representatives of the Mohawks signed the Treaty of Canandaigua with the United States, which allowed them to own land there. The Mohawk fought as allies of the British against the United States in the War of 1812. 20th century to present, the Mohawk have organized for more sovereignty at the reserves in Canada, pressing for authority over the people and lands. Tensions with the Quebec provincial and national governments have been strained during certain protests. In 1993, a group of Akwesasne Mohawk purchased 322 acres of land in the town of Palatine in Montgomery County, New York, which they named Kanatsiawaraki. It marked a return to their ancestral land. Mohawk communities today. Members of the Mohawk tribe now live in settlements in northern New York State and southeastern Canada. Many Mohawk communities have two sets of chiefs, who are in some sense competing governmental rivals. One group are the hereditary chiefs nominated by clan mother matriarchs in the traditional Mohawk fashion. Mohawk of most of the reserves have established constitutions with elected chief and councillors, with whom the Canadian and U.S. governments usually prefer to deal exclusively. The self-governing communities are listed below, grouped by broad geographical cluster, with notes on the character of community governance found in each. Northern New York, Canyon, K. Place of the Flint. Traditional governance, Kanetsioa, K. Place of the Washed Pail. Traditional governance, along the St. Lawrence, Indiana, Quebec, Akwesasne, where the partridge drums. Traditional governance, band. Tribal elections, Kanawa, K. on the Rapids. Canada, traditional governance, band. Tribal elections, Kanesata, K. where the snow crust is. Canada, traditional governance, band. Tribal elections. Southern Ontario, Kente, K. on the Bay. Traditional governance, band. Tribal elections. Wata, Maple Tree. Traditional governance, band. Tribal elections. OHSWE, Acute, Ken, ? Quote dot. Traditional governance, band. Tribal elections. The Mohawk form the majority of the population of this Iroquois Six Nations reserve. There are also Mohawk Orange Lodges in Canada. given increased activism for land claims, a rise in tribal revenues due to establishment of gaming on certain reserves or reservations, competing leadership, traditional government jurisdiction, issues of taxation, and the Indian Act. Mohawk communities have been dealing with considerable internal conflict since the late 20th century. Mohawk iron and steel workers in New York. Mohawk came from Kahnawake and other reserves to work in the construction industry in New York City in the early through the mid-20th century. They had also worked in construction in Quebec. The men were iron and steel workers who helped build bridges and skyscrapers. They worked from the 1930s to the 1970s on special labor contracts as specialists and participated in building the Empire State Building. The construction companies found that the Mohawk iron workers did not fear heights or dangerous conditions. The contracts offered lower than average wages to the First Nations people and limited labor union membership. The work and home life of Mohawk steel workers was documented in Don Owen's 1965 National Film Board of Canada documentary High Steel. The Mohawk community that formed in a compact area of Brooklyn, which they called Little Caughnawaga after the Homeland, is documented in Riahan Tarbell's Little Caughnawaga to Brooklyn and back, shown on PBS in 2008. This community was most active from the 1920s to the 1960s. The families accompanied the men, who were mostly from Kahnawake. Together they would return to Kahnawake during the summers. Tarbell is from Kahnawake and was working as a film curator at the National Museum of the American Indian, located in the former U.S. Customs House in Lower Manhattan. Since the mid-20th century, Mohawk have also formed their own construction companies. Others returned to New York projects. Approximately 200 Mohawk iron workers participated in rebuilding the One World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. They typically drive the 360 miles from the Kahnawake Reserve on the St. Lawrence River in Quebec to work the week in Lower Manhattan, and then return on the weekend to be with their families. A selection of portraits of these Mohawk iron workers were featured in an online photo essay for Time magazine in September 2012. Casinos. Both the elected chiefs and the controversial Warrior Society have encouraged gambling as a means of ensuring tribal self-sufficiency on the various reserves or Indian reservations. Traditional chiefs have tended to oppose gaming on moral grounds and out of fear of corruption and organized crime. Such disputes have also been associated with religious divisions. The traditional chiefs are often associated with the Longhouse tradition, practicing consensus democratic values, while the Warrior Society has attacked that religion and asserted independence. Meanwhile, the elected chiefs have tended to be associated with democratic, legislative and Canadian governmental values. On October 15, 1993, Governor Mario Cuomo entered into the Tribal State Compact between the St. Regis Mohawk tribe and the state of New York. The compact allowed the tribe to conduct gambling, including games such as baccarat, blackjack, craps and roulette, on the Iroquois Reservation in Franklin County under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. According to the terms of the 1993 compact, the New York State Racing and Wagering Board, the New York State Police and the St. Regis Mohawk Tribal Gaming Commission were vested with gaming oversight. Law enforcement responsibilities fell under the state police, with some law enforcement matters left to the tribe. As required by IGRA, the compact was approved by the United States Department of the Interior before it took effect. There were several extensions and amendments to this compact, but not all of them were approved by the U.S. Department of the Interior. On June 12, 2003, The New York Court of Appeals affirmed the lower court's rulings that Governor Cuomo exceeded his authority by entering into the compact absent legislative authorization and declared the compact void on October 19, 2004. Governor George Pataki signed a bill passed by the state legislature that ratified the compact as being nunc pro tunc, with some additional minor changes. In 2008, the Mohawk Nation was working to obtain approval to own and operate a casino in Sullivan County, New York, at Monticello Raceway. The U.S. Department of the Interior disapproved this action, although the Mohawk gained Governor Eliot Spitz's concurrence, subject to the negotiation and approval of either an amendment to the current compact or a new compact. Interior rejected the Mohawk application to take this land into trust. In the early 21st century, two legal cases were pending that related to Native American gambling and land claims in New York. The state of New York has expressed similar objections to the Department of Interior taking other land into trust for federally recognized tribes, which would establish the land as sovereign Native American territory, on which they might establish new gaming facilities. The other suit contends that the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act violates the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution as it is applied in the state of New York. In 2010 it was pending in the United States District Court for the Western District of New York.